The sound didn't come from the water. It came from the dam itself. A deep, grinding roar. Concrete under unimaginable pressure. Then the silence broke. Phones lit up across the valley. Emergency alert. Evacuate immediately. 5 days earlier, a strange vibration beneath Oroville Dam had exposed a problem no one expected. A hole in the main spillway the size of several houses. Something engineers believed was physically impossible. Now that wound was growing fast, and beneath it sat Oroville, a town living in the shadow of 770 feet of concrete, the tallest dam in the United States. A structure built to be a shield, and suddenly becoming the threat. Picture the moment the alert hit. Highways choke instantly. Radios buzz with half information. People leave homes unlocked, keys still in the ignition, pets behind, cash sitting in registers. Everyone moving, but no one actually getting away. And hanging over all of it was a single fear. If the dam gave way, the people closest to it wouldn't have minutes. They'd have seconds. If this alert hit your phone, and you had 60 minutes, what would you take first? The practical laptop, or the irreplaceable family photo album? Because what happened in 2017 wasn't sudden. It was the moment a choice made in 1961 finally resurfaced. Oroville's greatest weakness wasn't hidden underground. It was built into the assumptions of the people who designed it. When Oroville Dam was designed in the late 1950s and early 1960s, one belief guided the entire project. The bedrock beneath the spillways was strong enough that structural failures seemed impossible. Official reports described the foundation rock as competent and uniform, language that conveyed confidence the site could handle anything the spillways demanded. But the ground wasn't uniform, and the foundation studies were too limited to reveal that. Early geological investigations documented something the design didn't fully account for. The hillside was a mosaic of rock types, some solid, some heavily fractured, some weathered to depths of 20, 30, even 40 feet. These weakened zones could erode rapidly under high water pressure, yet the design proceeded without fully incorporating that variability. The result was a spillway placed on inconsistent foundations, supported by drainage systems sized for ideal conditions, with concrete slabs that cracked almost immediately after completion. For decades, inspectors documented symptoms: unexpectedly high drainage flows, repeated patching needs, persistent surface cracking. Each observation was treated as routine maintenance, not evidence of a deeper problem. The critical oversight. In nearly half a century of operation, inspections focused on the concrete surface, not on the geological weaknesses developing beneath it. The system checked what could be seen. The flaw existed where no one was looking. By 2017, 50 years of unaddressed symptoms had created a structure waiting for the right conditions to fail. Those conditions were coming. By early February 2017, a string of powerful atmospheric rivers and accelerating snowmelt had turned California's reservoirs into swollen basins. Lake Oroville was rising rapidly. Operators increased releases to protect the dam crest. On February 7th, around 10 a.m., cameras recorded an unusual flow pattern in the main spillway. Operators immediately stopped the flow to investigate the anomaly. When they lowered water levels enough to inspect, the scale of the problem was clear. A crater roughly 250 feet wide and 50 feet deep had opened in the concrete chute. Large concrete slabs had lifted and sheared away. This failure didn't begin with rock spontaneously tearing itself apart. The root mechanism was hydraulic. Water infiltrated deteriorated joints and under-drain pathways, creating uplift that forced the slabs upward. Once the slabs broke free, water escaped beneath the chute and began eroding the bedrock directly, excavating material at catastrophic speed. With inflows rising and no perfect option available, managers chose a middle path. On February 8th to 9th, they resumed controlled, reduced flows, hoping to maintain spillway function while limiting further erosion. For 3/10 days, that strategy bought time, but inflows kept surging, peaking at over 190,000 cubic feet per second. Then, shortly after 8 a.m. on February 11th, despite reduced releases, the lake climbed high enough to overtop the emergency spillway for the first time since 1968. The concrete weir held, but the slope below it was unlined hillside, bare earth with no protective armor. Erosion began almost immediately. If you were in a control room, would you keep forcing water through a damaged spillway you could monitor, or route it over an untested hillside you couldn't? Either choice now held real danger, and the lake kept rising. For 48 years, the emergency spillway was a ghost on the map. The moment it came to life, the earth beneath it began to vanish. Shortly after 8 a.m. on February 11th, 2017, Water finally crested the concrete emergency weir and poured down the unlined hillside below it, a slope with no armored channel to resist erosion. Within minutes, the bare earth began to eat itself alive. Engineers watching the live feeds saw the flow gouge canyons, carry slurry and rubble, and move with the hostility of an industrial drill, carving backward toward the concrete lip that was never supposed to be touched. The critical fear was immediate. If the erosion cut backward, undercutting the concrete crest, the entire work could collapse. The dam was just minutes away from becoming a 770-foot waterfall. State engineers and emergency managers shifted into full crisis mode. They increased releases through the damaged main spillway, intentionally accelerating its destruction. It was a desperate trade. Sacrifice one failed structure to save the whole system. Flows climbed toward 100,000 cubic feet per second in a last-ditch attempt to pull the lake level down. Meanwhile, crews and aircraft raced to hold the hillside together. Trucks ran rock. Helicopters hauled and dropped massive bags of stone and sand into the gouged channels to blunt the erosion. Heavy equipment scraped, packed, and armored anything that might hold. These weren't repairs. They were improvised minutes bys. As the emergency response escalated, warnings rolled into downstream communities. On February 12th, with erosion threatening to undercut the emergency weir and unleash an unstoppable surge, authorities issued an evacuation order for nearly 188,000 people across the Feather River Basin. It became the largest dam-related evacuation in modern U.S. history. It was the moment the physical crisis ended and the psychological one began. Disaster physics is predictable. Human behavior isn't. And nothing spreads faster than the moment people realize the water is coming. At approximately 5 p.m. on February 12th, the message hit phones, radios, TV crawls, police loudspeakers. Immediate evacuation. This is not a drill. For 188,000 people across Butte, Yuba, and Sutter counties, the next seconds were a collision of instinct and disbelief. Traffic exploded instantly. Downtown Oroville gridlocked within minutes. People ran on gas stations. Some cars stalled in intersections. Others overheated as drivers tried to muscle their way toward the nearest escape route. Police officers abandoned normal traffic control, waving people through intersections to keep the flow from freezing completely. And still, one question pulsed through the valley. Is the water winning? How much time do we actually have? Rumors began moving faster than official updates. The dam's already collapsing. The weir's gone. The flood is minutes away. Inside shelters, the psychological split was stark. Some sat in petrified silence, tracking every new alert. Others paced, replaying split-second decisions. Photo albums left behind, pets they didn't have time to find, belongings they might never see again. And for many evacuees, the last view they had was in the rearview mirror. A sunset sky glowing orange behind the silhouette of a dam that suddenly felt less like infrastructure and more like a loaded, primed weapon. Because no one knew whether the emergency spillway would hold through the night. Not the operators. Not the engineers. Not the governor. Nobody. The physical threat was still upstream. But the human crisis, the uncertainty, the helpless waiting, the dread of what morning would reveal, now lived entirely downstream. The sun went down, but the crisis didn't. Night didn't bring calm. It brought the hour-by-hour question that no one dared say out loud. What fails first? Up at the dam, floodlights blasted the hillside into harsh white as crews confronted a math problem that was now happening in real time. Water was still roaring over the emergency spillway, clawing at the eroded hillside below it, and every gallon pouring over the lip meant more pressure, more cutting, more undermining, more risk that the concrete wall at the top would suddenly shear away. Engineers weren't thinking in days. They were thinking in inches. Every inch the lake dropped was a second of life bought. Every inch it didn't was a second borrowed. Helicopters thundered overhead, ferrying in giant bags of rock to dump into the erosion zone. It was desperate. It was imprecise, but it was the only move they had. On the command radios, the language was clipped and clinical, but the meaning was unmistakable. Stabilization uncertain. Spillway crest integrity unknown. Continue lowering reservoir at maximum safe rate. Downstream, 188,000 evacuees waited in shelters and parking lots, refreshing phones, staring at news cheerings that never seemed to change. Upstream, the operators were fighting the clock with machines that had never been pushed this hard, this fast for this long. And as midnight approached, the numbers finally began to bend. The lake was dropping, inches at first, then feet. It wasn't victory, but But it was the first moment in 48 hours that didn't feel like the brink. Because for the first time since the spillway erupted, the operators could say something they hadn't dared say all day. The water is losing. When daylight finally broke over Lake Oroville, people expected to see a scar. What they saw was something closer to an autopsy. The main spillway looked like it had been carved open by a giant blowtorch, a canyon of shredded concrete and exposed rebar. The emergency spillway, the one no one ever thought they'd need, was now surrounded by a raw, scoured basin of collapsed earth and fractured rock. The damage wasn't cosmetic. It was structural, and it forced a brutal truth into the open. California's tallest dam had come within hours of losing control. Investigators, engineers, and federal regulators walked the site in stunned silence. This wasn't a mystery to solve. It was a warning spelled out in megatons of water, and the largest evacuation in California's modern history. The independent forensic report later revealed a pattern that feels uncomfortably familiar across American infrastructure. Years of overlooked inspections, maintenance budgets that didn't match the age of the structure, design assumptions from the 1960s that didn't match modern hydrology or extreme rainfall patterns, and an engineering and political culture that believed a worst-case scenario was too unlikely to prepare for. Downstream, evacuees returned to their homes carrying equal parts relief and anger. Some found localized flood damage. Most found only dust and silence. But all of them had seen how quickly state-of-the-art could turn into barely holding together. The cost to repair and rebuild the spillways? Over $1 billion. The cost to repair public trust? No number big enough. But the biggest change wasn't concrete or steel. It was psychological. Across California, and eventually across the country, a new question emerged. If America's tallest dam can nearly fail, what else is quietly one storm away? Because Oroville wasn't just a near disaster. It was a preview. A preview of what aging infrastructure looks like under a climate that no longer plays by the old rules. And for millions living downstream of dams, levees, spillways, and reservoirs built half a century ago, that question may be the most important one we face next.